But really excited to have today's speakers here, Anusha Iyer, Brian Park, and Romy Parzick, three very successful entrepreneurs and tech leaders. And I could do a very bad job introducing each of them, but instead, I'm going to let each of them give a short intro before we get into the questions. So Anusha, do you want to kick things off with a quick background?
Sure, thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Really pleased to be here and excited to learn more about Romy and Brian as well. I'm a CMU grad from the class of 2002 in the School of Computer Science, and I've been in the DC area for, I guess, nearly 20 years now, and primarily in the cybersecurity space. I started off in the area at the Naval Research Lab, worked on a couple of different programs there with in the areas of reverse engineering of code and tactical edge networking, and then spent a stint with secure managed services, and then moved to managing a number of DARPA programs for a company called Galois. And a couple of years ago, jumped out to start Corsha. It's a cybersecurity company based in the Tysons Corner area. And I guess we're about 2.5 years into it, and venture backed. And our mission is really to help enterprises protect kind of their hidden connections, their application connections, APIs and things, as more and more enterprises are moving towards cloud and embracing digital transformation. So happy to be here and tell you a little bit about the journey.
Awesome, thanks so much. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Brian Park. I graduated in '98 in the H and Less Stress. I guess it's called DTRA now. That's how old I feel. I am the managing director of an accelerator called Spark Labs Cyber and Blockchain. Basically, Spark Labs is it's a network of accelerators. It's a VC group that has 12 accelerators all over the world, mostly in the APAC region. We've invested close to 300 startups in the last 10 years. Those include Lyft. There's a whole bunch of them. I can't name it, but I wasn't the original founder. This guy named Bernard Moon. I was later brought in as a managing director. And so we invest in companies from seed to Series A. And we have accelerators, in Seoul, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, Oman, Australia. And we, this particular one that's we're, actually going to be launching, it's going to be focused on cybersecurity, blockchain, really more on, and I'd love to talk, more about the blockchain stuff if you guys are interested in that as a subsequent panel. But yeah, we're investing into decentralized finance type of things. So the things that you're seeing with Bitcoin, right? That's one thing, but it's like there's a whole nother world. And you're hearing things, just kind of like what you're seeing with Wall Street. This whole thing about decentralized finance becomes a lot more pertinent. And before that, Spark Labs, I was with an organization called Startup Grind, which is one of the largest high-tech independent entrepreneur communities. So it's like if you think of Silicon Valley, Techstars, right? YC, that's the community that we represented. And, we kind of grew it kind of like very similar to this one, from 20 chapters to 600 chapters and over 2.5 million entrepreneurs. And so, yeah, really excited to talk today and share sort of my experience and also some of the interviews that I've done with, a few hundred of these like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and love to share some of the wisdoms that I've learned from them.
Awesome, thanks. It's great to have you, Brian, because I think you bring the perspective of not only an entrepreneur, but also an investor. So it's nice to have someone who's been on both sides of the table. Yeah. Romy, could you share your background? You've obviously started companies. You're now the CEO of a company that you didn't start, but were brought on later. So if you could just maybe tell everyone about how you kind of got to this place.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So I'm a class of 2000 CMU grad. It was actually the last year that they called it GSIA, the year after it became Tepper. So it was also the last year you could get a degree in industrial management. After that, the degrees became business degrees. I graduated in 2000. I also did my MBA at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. My career has been primarily focused in financial services, and specifically, how do you align financial services, the products, with the best interest of the consumer in mind. That isn't always the case about how companies are run. And to me, it's really important to be part of an organization where you have the consumer's best interest in mind. Like Sam said, I actually am currently CEO of a company that I did not start. I joined a startup in 2018 as COO, and as part of basically a turnaround that the board was trying to make. Fairly soon after, I stepped into the CEO role. So that was November of 2019, and as you all know, soon afterwards, we were hit by a pandemic. So I have a lot of interesting stories to tell about trying to turn around a company and the challenges of doing so when you're hit by a pandemic. Just personally, I live in Austin. I have 2 kids, and I'm married to my college sweetheart, a CMU guy who's really good friends with Sam. So that's it.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. So to kick off the panel, there's some different schools of thought about whether entrepreneurs are made or whether they're born, and people sort of have a predisposition towards entrepreneurship. I'm wondering if, for the panelists, if looking back on your sort of childhood, there's anything that was a good sign that you'd be an entrepreneur one day. I mean, for example, from my childhood, I remember once we created our own newspaper, and we would just like make it with crayons and markers, and we went around trying to sell it to all of our neighbors. No one bought it, but looking back, that may have been a sign. So I'm wondering if there's any for you that sort of you remember that was a good indication that maybe one day you'd grow up to be an entrepreneur. Romy, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I never liked to play house, but I always loved to play store. I think it would drive my parents crazy with like setting up stores and putting price tags on things and trying to sell them like the toys that I already had. And sort of tangential to that, my mom likes to say that I always like to take charge no matter what age group I was in. So she just would laugh when there were 11-year-olds taking direction from like a 6-year-old. So I think I always, they like to tell little girls they're bossy. So I think I've always been bossy, and I'm okay with that.
Awesome. Brian, anything from your childhood?
Yeah. Well, actually, I wanted to kind of make, like you asked, I thought that was a very interesting question about, are we made or are we, nurtured, born, naturally born entrepreneurs? I'm from the school of thought. I mean, just listening to a lot of stories out there, I think we are all natural entrepreneurs. And what I mean by that, it's kind of like part of us being human, right? I mean, if you ever think about just like how even this nation was found, right? I mean, it was an entrepreneurial, like, it was an entrepreneurial thing with Christopher Columbus, right? It was like, he was like, hey, I'm going to go to the New World, monarchy of Spain, and I want 10%, right? And they're looking at him like, yeah, you must be crazy, because, yeah, sure, get 10%, because you're not going to make it. Like it's 50-50, you're not going to make it, but if you want 10%, do it, right? And so I think that it's kind of like in our blood, right? I think that, if we were in a position where, hey, would you like to work in this position and, just, do that, in a big organization, or, hey, there's money on the table, you can run with this and make your own business, right? Like, I feel like more often than not, people would rather take the latter, right? They'll do it. They're like, hey man, I want to optimize my gain. And so I think it's natural, right? And so being that said, like my first entrepreneur experience was, I was an Air Force brat, right? So my dad, we lived on base, and all the houses are all on the row, right? And I was like, hey, I want to do a lawn service. So I actually saw my friend do it, and I was like, I'm going to create a competing service, right? But I'll just charge like maybe $1 less. And he wasn't really happy about that. But then I was like, man, I think I might be, I think I might be entrepreneur because I had the audacity to create a competition and not feel bad afterwards. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Anusha, anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's always been if something seemed limiting or tough or slightly impossible, that's when I would always seem to jump in as a child. So I think my parents would always say, the worst thing you could do for me is tell me I can't do something. And then I'd be like, tell me more of why you think there's this thing I can't do. So, I guess a quick story is I grew up in Ohio. And in elementary school, we had Ohio Day, huge deal, by the way, right? And so we would all have to pick these projects from this list to showcase the beautiful state. And one of the projects was to make Buckeyes. So for those of you that have never had a Buckeye, it's this kind of ball of peanut butter and chocolate and just quite incredible. And so this project was about making like 50 of them, I think, as like a sample, but there's like 600 kids that were coming to this event. So of course I was like, that feels limiting. Why not just make one for everybody? So instead of making 50, I think I got enough ingredients to make like 800. And to this day, if my mother hears anyone say the word Buckeye, she'll call me up and yell at me because it took months to get the smell out of the kitchen. But it's that idea of just, pushing boundaries and, doing things that really shouldn't be possible at a particular time or shouldn't be reasonable. And that's kind of, I think, what drives a lot of entrepreneurs, right?
That's great. Thanks. So, we all went to Carnegie Mellon, and I think we all probably, as a result, had like really good job prospects when we graduated, depending on what year we graduated, how the economy was doing. And, like me, many of us probably went and got good jobs. And then the hardest thing I find is taking the leap into, leaving a good paying job and becoming an entrepreneur. So I'm curious about to hear each of your sort of entrepreneurial origin story. In other words, how did you make the transition from, a good, career in management or technology, for Brian and Anusha, who had, software development positions, and how did you do that? And how did you know what to do? And how did you feel confident to do that? And how do you develop the skills beyond the technical skills that you had? Brian, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think, going from the leap of a technical person to now a business person, running, not just, being in your silo and just focusing on building, but now you have to run a company, and now it's like all this other stuff that you have to worry about. There's a saying in Silicon Valley, if you ever see like, just even the top companies there, right? So Facebook, Google, Twitter, Snapchat, right? And then again, those are more retail, more consumer. But if you ever notice, like what they have most in common is that the CEO is actually a great product person. He comes from like knowing how to build stuff. So that's the point, is that, in order to be a great entrepreneur, in my opinion, is you gotta be a builder, right? Like the world's pyramid, there had to be a guy that had the vision to build it, right? And so I always think that the best entrepreneurs are great product folks, and they don't necessarily have to know how to program, but they have to still understand why is good and why it's better than the technology, why it's better than the competition. And the reason why I thought why I made that transition from a product to an action operator, running a company, is because you're actually in a very good sweet spot of getting great product feedback from the customer, right? It's like you're trying to sell it. It's like, it's not really quite gelling here. It doesn't look like he wants to buy it just yet. But if I did a tweak, I'm going to run over back to my product or my engineer team and say, hey, can you do that? Tweak it. Okay, how fast can you do it? Okay, great. And you come back to the customer and say, okay, now I have it. And then it's like, not really. So the point is that for sort of product sales feedback is very tight. And that's why these companies are very successful, right? Like these sort of consumer and enterprise type companies as well. So that's where I sort of felt that that transition from building to running a company was easier because you were sort of there. And at the end of the day, it's always about trying to bring revenue to your company. Because if you don't have revenue, then you can't hire more people and you can't grow it. You can't scale it, right? And then even when you're looking for, when you're looking for funding, like you still have to have that product market fit. You still have to figure out like what can we scale, because if you have nothing there, there's no sense of us putting money, gasoline on top of a fire, right? So to speak. And so that, I think that's why I think to make that transition is easier when you do that. So that's kind of been my experience.
Yeah, that's great. Having a product background is certainly helpful. Romy, you talked about how you were kind of thrust into your current CEO role, but I also know that you started a fitness studio while you had another full-time job. Maybe you could talk to us about how that came about and how you decided to take that leap while still working, full-time.
Yeah. So my husband Ryan and I came from the DC and North Carolina, like Durham area, where we had found gyms that we felt like we were, when we went there, it felt sort of like home. And in the part of Austin we lived in, there's just new housing going up, but really not that many services that we felt like met our needs. So at some point I kind of just decided like, well, like he and I are both athletes. Like we've been working out our whole lives. I've got a business degree. Why can't I just start it? So I sort of just took one foot and put it in front of the other and tried to leverage some free resources. The University of Texas has a good free legal clinic for people starting small businesses, and just started to leverage connections that I had. And then all of a sudden I sort of found myself with this fitness studio. From the startup standpoint, what I would say is, and this sort of fits into, I know, a topic we're going to get into later, but in terms of sort of obstacles you've hit, but in my sort of corporate career, I have always moved up very quickly and gained more responsibility, maybe at a younger age than some of my peers. And about 2.5 years ago was the first time I really had felt I hit a glass ceiling. Like I sort of intellectually understood that there were glass ceilings for women and for people of color, but I just had felt that I had never really hit that. And when you hit it, it hurts really bad. It really does, because you look around and you're like, I'm smarter than these people. I have more responsibility. I bring in the most revenue. Like I've checked all the boxes. What could it possibly be? What could I possibly do differently to get to the next level? And I remember sitting down with my manager at the time, and he was going to give me like real feedback. And he gave me 3 pieces of feedback, which were funny. One was, Romy, you wear your ambition on your sleeve and nobody likes that. Number 2, you're too emotional and business is not emotional. And number 3, you just know too much about people. You must have too much water cooler time. So those 3 things were always things I'd actually prided myself on the plus side, right? Ambition meant I had a ton of drive, like give me something, I'm going to do the next best thing with whatever you give me. Being emotional meant like I had a lot of passion for what I do. I'm not one of those like robotic people that walks in and like, what's the task? We're going to do the task. Like I am emotional in what I do, and I do not apologize for that. And the third, on water cooler time, just made me want to just lose my mind, because what it meant was that I was really well networked with people, and I did know a lot of what was going on at all levels of the organization, something he wasn't willing to do. And so I just remember that moment, because after all this sort of battling with him to like figure out why I wasn't getting to the next level, and he gave me what he thought was this very clairvoyant feedback, I stood up and I shook his hand and I said, thank you very much, appreciate it. Because right then I knew that no matter what I did, this person would never see me differently. He would see me through his very narrow lens that would not be able to really capture the beauty of the things that I could bring to the table. And so that's what made me step out of the corporation and say like, let me try to go do something that, you know, I have more ownership of and that I can shape. And I did step in at the COO level, like I said, but, you know, weird things happen and suddenly I found myself in the CEO level. So I don't think it's necessarily always a very direct path, but I think if you ask the right questions and seek the answers, sometimes the answers, even if you don't like them, can help you make a change in your life that is actually better for you and that is needed.
Thanks. It's such a powerful and personal story. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, Anusha, you were, you know, really doing well in your career, and you were like climbing up in the federal space and had all the, you know, you could tell like your career progression. Why would you want to step away from that and take all the risk of you know, being an entrepreneur? Tell us about what you were thinking at that time and kind of how you made that decision.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, there are some days I question that myself, but but for the most part, you know, I think to what Romy was speaking about, leadership, it's really not a title, right? It's a mentality, and it's so much more than, you know, whether it's that 3 letters or, and I feel like throughout my career, I've always been kind of clinging to staying technical, but then always being pulled into more of these leadership type roles. And so when I moved more towards the DARPA side, it ended up being a bit more of a hard choice where I wasn't able to stay in my happy place and, you know, every so often at least get a little bit of code in there. And it did end up being a lot more programmatic. These are large multi-million-dollar programs, you know, a lot of regulation, a lot of reporting. It's just heavy. And I found out quickly that wasn't nearly as fun for me. And so when I had this opportunity arise to come in and start Corsha as CTO, just that idea of being able to kind of get my hands dirty back again on the technical side and define how my day was and define the vision, the technical vision for the company, where I spent my time, where others spend their time towards this goal was kind of tough to pass up.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Romy, you kind of kicked it off about, you know, the challenges that you know, women entrepreneurs face. I'd love to dig into that a little deeper, but also I'd love to also hear, you know, the flip side. Like, are there anything that you found to be, you know, an advantage or sort of a superpower that you have as a woman entrepreneur? Anusha, you want to just continue talking and maybe you can address that one first?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think one of the maybe natural stereotypes is maybe that ability to have empathy and understand. And that goes, it works on both ends. It works both in terms of understanding a customer need and, you know, being able to sort of place yourself in those shoes in those types of discussions, but then also understanding a lot of the struggles and stresses that are going to come from trying to build a product from the ground up with a team that, you know, is potentially coming from a lot of different places and thrown together towards this one common purpose with a lot of constraints on them, right? And so I feel like that element of empathy is probably what I'd say has been my superpower on the technical management side.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a big one, and often overlook just those kind of soft skills and you know, the ability to put yourself in someone's shoes and really understand where they're coming from. Brian, you did a lot of work. You're a mentor for a Black female founder group. Would love to hear you know, some of the experiences you've had, and you know, what stories you heard, what, you know, were some of the obstacles, and how did you mentor you know, minority female founders to sort of help them overcome some of the kind of systematic challenges that they were facing?
Yeah, so this was actually very close to my heart. You know, the thing is that before BFF, you know, I was actually it was actually through my church. We were doing tutoring early on in my career, maybe when I was maybe 5 years working professionally. And I joined this organization called ULC, Unique Learning Center. And really what that was is that it was tutoring. It's just tutoring elementary school kids, but it was in the projects, right, in DC. And that's when I really had a very eye-opening like perspective. I'm like, holy cows, like this is a completely different world. And I remember, like, just do simple things like 2 + 2 is 4, right? It's like very thing like anybody could do, but it meant so much for these kids. And then, after the program, and it was every week, go from like after work, so it was 7 to like 8, 9, 10. I would have to actually go, in the van and drop off these kids. But it's like we actually had to walk the kids to their door because there would be drug dealers, like intercepting them. And so that's where I really got a heart for just like, hey, the underserved, they don't have much exposure type of folks, right? That's where now, like when I saw this in the VC world, I'm like, well, there's definitely a different type of systematic racism that was built in. So so with the black female founders, like if you think about it in the Silicon Valley, you'll see like everybody like like you've been to CMU, right? Like you go to any engineer class, right? And you kind of expect that's what you're going to see in a tech firm. So it's like, white male, Asian male, right? It's like kind of smelly a little bit, right? In the labs, that you went there. But it was like, okay, that's kind of like what tech firms are. I mean, at least 20 years ago. And then, what really got me, I remember seeing this picture of like what equality looks like. You see, there's like this fence and there's three heads peeking out, right? And you're like, oh, they look like they're equally tall and they're just peeking. But then when you go right behind it, there's one short person who has the box. He's like sitting on the box, and then another one's like a little bit, and then there's the guy that doesn't have anything. He's just looking. That's kind of like how I see Silicon Valley, where not everybody has the same starting point, and then someone has to be that extra step for the person for them to even be on the same playing field, right? So Black female founders, that organization, if you think about it, is exactly the opposite of the white male founder, the Asian male founder, right? It's the exact opposite. And my experience there is that some of these entrepreneurs, like female entrepreneurs, they would have some great ideas, and I would like literally open up my Rolodex and throw as much as I could, right? And still, it was almost like going uphill, right? And that's when you realize, wow, this thing here is actually a real thing. And one of the biggest things that I always keep on hearing about, that it's not intentional, but it's definitely an unintentional systematic sexism and racism in the VC, is when they use the word pattern recognition. They're like, hey, it's pattern recognition. That's how we look at companies, right? If you think about it, if you don't look like Mark Zuckerberg, right? So, coming from Harvard, Elon Musk, Sergey Brin, coming from Stanford, right? CS, then I'm not feeling so comfortable, right? And again, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if you went to your CS class, it's like, that's the type of people you're looking at, right? So that's when I realized, look, I'll try to do as much as I can, being on the other side of the spectrum, so that I can kind of, just like in my ULC days, I really want to help the folks that actually, even if you if you had all the optimal ingredients, they still won't have a fair chance than if a person who was just white male, Asian male, with just not extra help, right? So yeah, it really gave me a perspective, and I would actually just encourage anyone who's in the sort of the tech universe here, to always be sort of cognizant about that, right? Like if you hear somebody, especially that doesn't look like a tech entrepreneur, right? In your mind, and we all probably have that sort of like image, then take the extra, extra effort to like help that person out. I mean, if you are able to do it, right? Like you have to be very proactive, like be more proactive than you normally would, just because of that illustration, right? And it's real. That illustration is real, and I experienced it firsthand, you know, tutoring, and then also trying to help out, you know, these Black female founders. So
that's great, and you make a great point about how important the Rolodex is, and even if there's two identical people and they have the same, you know, hard work and intelligence and creativity, but one has a really robust, you know, Rolodex just from who they were, where they went to school, who their parents were, you know, it's the other one is going to be at a huge disadvantage.
Yep.
Romy, just to sort of tie a bow around this, you know, what advice would you give to a female founder, you know, that would be different from that you might give to you know, a white male founder as they were kind of setting off on her entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, I love the idea that you put forward about a superpower. I think that, you know, again, not trying to be stereotypical in any way, but women do tend to have a superpower around what Anusha was saying related to empathy and really being able to read between the lines. And so what I found is a lot of times I have two male colleagues like butting heads repeatedly. And I'm like, okay, so-and-so, do you realize that what so-and-so is really saying is that his feelings are hurt? And so-and-so, do you realize what so-and-so is really saying is that he doesn't think that you appreciate the work he does? And they're both like, huh? You know, so like, I think there's just like that element of beyond the intellectual capacity. If you're assuming the intellectual capacity is the same, there is a superpower of really being the emotional intelligence of being able to help people work better together, and then not being shy to just put those things out there. I mean, during the pandemic, for instance, like and the other thing I feel really proud of is that I have pulled in a lot of people that are not sort of a tech stereotype into our company. So our company is actually 70% women, many of whom had never been in a tech startup before. And they're some of our best employees and hardest working employees, and they've just really blown my mind. And just giving people opportunity that may not have that opportunity. But I just think it's really, you know, it's just really fascinating what you can do when you sort of break down the barriers of what like is traditionally supposed to be in each spot in your company. And you really think about the core sort of talents that you need. And then the last thing I would say is, I remember very starkly sitting at this really nice steakhouse restaurant. It's Texas, so of course we're having a steakhouse restaurant dinner. And the chair of my board had just told me that they were going to be removing the CEO. And he asked me, we would like you to be the next CEO. Would you like to do it? And all my first reactions in my head were all the reasons I wasn't ready, right? And I think that's very much a female reaction. Like, well, I'd really like to work on these 5 things before I step into the CEO role. And then I just like smushed all those feelings down and was like, yep, I'm ready. Give it to me, you know? And then I went home and freaked out. But I think that's something that I would say is like, usually your male counterpart is going to say, yes, I'm ready. And if you don't stand up and say, yes, you're ready, even if inside you have all these demons telling you you're not ready, you are going to miss opportunities. So I think it's, you know, do the male thing there, step up and say, I'm ready, even if you're not, and you will be ready.
That's great. Great advice. Switching gears a little bit, here we are in 2020, you know, doing video chats that we never thought we'd be doing. Can you guys each talk a little about, you know, how you've adapted to COVID, how your companies have adapted, what you've had to focus more time on, you know, how the culture of your companies, your organizations have changed, how employee engagement has changed, and just sort of what you've had to do and what you've learned about sort of adapting and kind of leading through crisis. Anusha, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah. You know, so I will say we probably have taken a path that a lot of companies have taken. We started off full virtual and then eased back into this kind of optional hybrid mode where people can come in under certain restrictions and things like that. And there were a few things that I guess we did prior to the pandemic that proved really helpful during the pandemic. So one of them was, we're an agile shop, so we follow kind of agile methodology for our development with like stand-ups and sprints and the whole bit. And just to tighten feedback loops, for a while now, we've been doing, instead of just one daily stand-up, 2 daily stand-ups. So we do one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And it's really been helpful, not from, yes, from a productivity perspective, but even more so from a culture perspective of just having that face-to-face check-in. And I think, the other thing is to, especially with a full virtual workforce, allow those types of, meetings that are intended to be quick to stray a little bit, have conversations that you might have otherwise had face-to-face, and create kind of the opportunity for that type of connection in a virtual environment. Certainly things like Slack and having that asynchronous method are really great. That's really helped us. But it's hard to foster the same type of culture when you're all sitting across a Zoom call, right? So I think, tomorrow we're trying out our first virtual Halloween party with a virtual escape room and, kind of snacks being sent out and the whole thing, but it's definitely, it's a concerted effort to keep everyone connected.
That's great. Brian, I assume you're running this accelerator and you have to probably make some really hard decisions, over Zoom calls without, getting to know people face to face. We'd love to hear kind of how your organization has adapted to this environment.
Yeah, actually Spark Labs, we were actually, we started as a full-time residential program, and then we actually gradually went into a hybrid model like 7-8 years ago. So what that really means is like, do we have to be there full time, all the time on site? No. In fact, most of our portfolio companies, they're not really there to get space. They're there because they want to get access to the network, right? And what we'll have is like a launch, a kickoff, meeting, right, on every cohort. So then all the folks can meet each other. We may have, and then we'll have like a mid program event. This is normal circumstances. This is pre-COVID, right? So like, we'll actually have a mid program where either one founder will fly in, right, and still participate for maybe a week. And then at the end of the 14 weeks, it's the demo day, right? So anybody who was involved, they would all go in there, and it's the big, what do you call it? The beauty pageant, right? Everybody's there, right? Now it's changed, right? Obviously, we have to do everything virtually. So instead of having, the hybrid model, it's completely virtual. And the thing is that, it's kind of like the streaming model, right? Like, I don't know if you've seen the meme where it's like, hey, the most expensive streaming, right? It was like, Hulu, right? like YouTube, like $11, $12, and Harvard, $50,000, right? Because it's streaming, right? It's kind of the same thing for us. Like, we have to cut them a check, and it's like, wow, we're really, what are we getting for this, right? It's getting part of a company, but it's still a lot of money, right, for virtual. But things that it's still the same, right? The only thing is that maybe geographically, like we have one in Taiwan, right? And Taiwan has gotten the outbreak under control, and so now they're able to do on site, like they're able to do in person activities there, right? As long as everyone has their mask, and we'll do that. But then obviously here we can't, right? I think things are still going to be challenging, until we find a vaccine. But until then, we're still going to be doing things. We're still trying to figure it out, right? Like a hybrid, and it's going to be all really situational to the geographies. So
that's great. Romy, maybe you can talk about sort of how you've been managing through this crisis, and when you come out of this crisis, hopefully sometime next year, you know, do you feel like, you know, your company will be better positioned? You know, how you have grown? How is there a silver lining to all this, that if once you get through, you come out the other side and you're stronger because of it? I think you're on mute.
Let me give you a little context of sort of where our company is and you know, where we were when the pandemic hit. So I was raising Series A for our company, and we closed the Friday of the week where the first market hit happened, the really deep market hit in March. And that Monday, I was like, shit, there's no way we're closing this round. Like, it's just not going to happen. So I spent Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday calling all my investors, like trying to shore it up. And we did actually close. I'm very thankful for that. And all of those investors said of the other deals they were in within sort of a 2-week period, all the rest of them fell through. Ours was the only one that, you know, each of them were a part of that actually closed. And so to me, that signaled that I could not take that money that I was, you know, that we had gotten as an investment and spend it in the same way I had intended to spend it prior to that happening, right? Because when you're going out for Series A, you're saying, oh, this is how I'm going to spend it. This is how big we're going to get. All these wonderful things are going to happen. Just kidding. Our country shutting down. Now what? So we went into a very immediate crisis mode where now I think that has been hugely important to our success and how we've positioned ourselves. So it was basically like nothing was safe. I immediately got us out of our lease. I was like, I don't see us going back anytime soon. I'm going to negotiate out of this lease. I don't think the landlord knew what hit him, because he was still in the like, oh, this is just a 2-week thing. It'll be done in 2 weeks. And I was like, I don't care. Here's my price. I'm not coming back. So you either take this or, you know, good luck. If there's, you know, I was kind of being hard ass, like, good luck. There might not be anything left when you come back for more. Right. So we got out of our lease. And what I really think helps in a crisis is like, if you sort of have to get really focused on what's very important and where you need to spend the money. And so what it did for me is it helped me, you know, there's people sort of that you're like, oh, you know, maybe with a little more coaching, they might work, or with just a little bit more, you know, teamwork or what, I don't know. You make excuses for what is going to help that person get from where they are to becoming an A player. In a crisis, there's no time. It's like, dude, you're not an A player. I'm sorry. There's a crisis. Here's your severance package. We're moving on. So what it helped me do is just clear out the noise in terms of people, in terms of places we were spending. And I got the whole team involved. I'm like, look under the couch cushions, right? Like metaphorically, if there's money under the couch cushions, find it and put it in our piggy bank. And we were able to like maintain and actually grow our revenue base tremendously. And we cut from January sort of monthly operating to, let's say by August-ish, we were 50%, spending 50% less each month and making more money. And I never would have made those cuts because it just didn't feel like they were necessary when, you know, the country was running well and it seemed like I could raise money easily in early 2021. When those options were taken off the table, it really forced us to make really hard decisions and make them fast. And so I think it's because of that we'll be well positioned to really, you know, weather the storm. And Sam, you said 2021. I'm more pessimistic, so I'm trying to get us well through 2021 for a great 2022. I would love to be proven wrong that we're going to recover in the next year, but I'm playing it on the sort of safe side, and we're trying to manage our business such that I won't be out raising until probably 2022.
Got it. Great. I'm going to ask one last question of each of you, and then we're going to turn it over to some audience questions. In my entrepreneurial journey, I've made so many mistakes, and like all of the most obvious ones, the ones that, if you just read a couple books by Ben Horowitz, you could probably avoid. But so I could talk a whole hour about those. But I'd love if you could each share just one mistake that you made that you think others can learn from, and kind of how it happened and what the kind of lesson was. Anusha, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree. We could probably go for another few hours on the list of mistakes, right? So I think one of the ones that comes to mind that I definitely learned from, hopefully, you can learn from my mistake, is about a year ago, I wanted to bring in kind of someone more in a senior engineering role. So I brought in a VP of engineering underneath me, and fantastic individual, just, great caliber, resume, the whole bit. But what I realized quickly was that he was no longer really hands-on, no longer really kind of doing the work, more used to managing others doing the work, right? And that is a pattern that doesn't work in a startup. You basically have to be oaring. Every single person on your team has to be oaring. And that's what I tell my folks today is like, don't bring me problems. Don't even bring me ideas if you don't have a plan on how to execute the idea, right? Like, it's got to be, what am I going to do to solve this thing? And so, I think early on, especially with hiring, it's, I think you want more doers rather than the big thinkers.
That's great. Brian, what's one mistake that you've made that we can all learn from?
I mean, if I had a nickel for every mistake I made, I'd be a billionaire. So the biggest mistake you can avoid is, and I learned this early on, actually, it was straight out of college. Never do business with people you don't trust. What happened was we were first young and naive, right? I was coming out of Merrill Lynch, and we're like, hey, we're young, let's get a few friends and let's go put a team together, right? And had some CMU folks there and folks from Cornell, and it was a Stanford guy in there. But the problem was this, right? Because it was a little different back then. I was introduced to one of my a much older guy who had a lot of success in doing trading stocks, right? it was actually one of my dad's friends, right? So I'm like, oh. And he's like, hey, really talk to him and try to work out something. So what happened was, I was like, man, I don't know if I really trust this guy, but okay, whatever. The idea was, we're gonna make this XML identity platform very similar to DoubleClick, right, where you're able to sort of track the cookies for ads and stuff, right? And so we kind of had built this sort of like the foundation, and we had it all set up, and we were actually pitching it, but the guy was the one who was like, hey, I'll take care of everything. Don't worry, I'll get you introductions, right? And so we were like pitching to a lot of like VCs, back then. And so the problem was that he strung us along for like 6 to 8 months, and I was just like, oh, guess I don't really trust him, but hey, what could come out of this, right? And what ended up happening was he was like, oh yeah, by the way, none of you guys get equity. Like, we're like, what? And so, the problem is that we weren't asking the right questions. We didn't like, we weren't, assertive enough because he was so experienced, right? And he had, he made millions of dollars, right, off of stocks or whatever, right? But he had no clue about what we were doing. So one of the things that I've learned was, there's probably 4 things that I would say, right? There's this rule they always say in the Silicon Valley. They say like, hacker, hustler, designer, right? I have my own version of that. So hacker, hustler, designer, right? That's I have my own version. It's called the 3Ds. It's called developer, designer, douchebag. Okay. And what I mean by that is you got to get the developer, you got to get a designer because you have to make it look nice. But then the douchebag has to understand, right? Like everybody knows you're important. Everybody knows you're going to bring the money, but you got to know where your place is, right? As you know, if you do, then that means you have equal respect for all the ones who are building, right? So the thing is that when you have those three components, that's good. But then the other second part is those three, the three legs of the horse need to have equal equity. Everybody has to be transparent and everybody has to have the same skin in the game, right? The moment that you have the business guy has 95% and then the developer designer only has 5%, there's already there's already like a lopsidedness in just the power play, right? So everybody has to be like, equity. It has to be equal. 3 is like, again, it comes go back to 2, but it has to be 100% transparent. Everybody has to know what's going on. They trust each other, right? And there's nothing that's being secretly done, right? Like everybody knows what's going on. It's completely transparent. So therefore everybody trusts each other, right? And then 4 is you want to be in a team of natural born builders, right? It's the reference from natural born killers, right? But like natural born builders, which is, if you look at the companies like Apple and you look at Sun Microsystem, Oracle, right? Microsoft, you always saw the douchebag, but then the developer, the builder, Wozniak, right? He was a natural born builder. Like if you go to his garage, stuff was all over the place, and you're like, and he's like, I can't believe they're going to be paying me to do this, right? Like I'm doing, like they naturally just build stuff, right? And so you want to be part of that team of natural born builders, right? So, and one last thing, there was a quote they always say, failure, every time you make mistakes, right? It's okay, right? And there was this guy, Dan Nelson, he had written many books on this, but he had quote, don't be afraid to start don't be afraid to start over. This time you're not starting from scratch, you're starting from experience. So whatever you guys, whatever mistake is that now that's in your coffer, that's a feather in the hat, now not to do it again, right? And that is worth, that's worth a lot of money for having that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
That's my little spiel.
One of the biggest mistakes I think entrepreneurs make is in that formation team and founding the company and splitting up the equity and not spending enough time really hashing out all those scenarios with their co-founders. Romy, any last thing you want to add about mistakes that others can hopefully avoid?
Just 2 quick things. One is I was talking to one of my mentors about some of the people in my team, and I kept using the term, I just don't know. I just don't know if it's going to work out. And the mentor said to me, when you don't know, you know. And he was right. Like the reason I didn't know if it was going to work out is because I was thinking of all the work that I'd have to do to get it to a point where it might work. And so I just love that. When you don't know, you actually know. And the second thing I would say is, I think especially for women, demand things in writing. Don't take people at their word. Oh, you're going to get this much equity, or this is how much we're going to pay you. And then you're working for a few months and they're like, oh, did we say that much? I'm like, yeah, you said that much. So make sure you get everything in writing at the very beginning, especially if you're coming in, taking over for another leadership group.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so that's all my questions. We're going to open it up to audience questions now. Nick is going to sort of moderate those. There's a couple in the chat already here, but if you guys have other questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please throw them in the chat now or send them to Nick directly, and I'll hand it over to Nick.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Romy, Anusha, and Brian for your time. I will agree that we all had a lot to learn today. That being said, we will jump into the Q&A round because the audience has a couple of questions. And the first question is from Sras Gupta. I hope I said your name right. So Sras, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure, thanks, Nick. So yeah, my name is Sras Gupta. I'm a Heinz 2018 graduate. I've been working as a data scientist at Steven. It's a software as a service firm in Tysons Corner, Washington, D.C. area. Before I get into the question, I would want to thank the speakers to share their journey and their wisdom. It has been truly motivating and insightful. Thanks a lot. So I have a couple of questions. So I'm being myself like someone who wants to start on this entrepreneurial journey. So first question is a very noob one, but I'm going to ask that anyway. So first is like, how do you get started on this journey? Like, how do you build connection and reach out to people, and how do you network with people? That's the first question. And second is like, let's say if you have an idea, how do you test the market feasibility of that idea? How do you find that market product basically makes like if that works or not? Thank you.
So I can take that. So that's probably well, that we can probably go over that in a breakout session because I actually have. I mean, I also do workshops on this very topic about product market fit. My probably big advice would be like, you know, one of the things about being an entrepreneur is not about like the idea itself and then going out and doing it. From what I've experienced and from what I've heard from other entrepreneurs, it's almost like people became entrepreneurs by accident because the opportunity presented itself, right? So it's not so much the idea, but it's more of the timing and if you were ready to seize on the opportunity, right? So case in point, you know, right after, you know, I worked at AOL, you know, 9/11 happened and there was an opportunity for, you know, for me to start a business, but I didn't know what, but I just knew that, you know, hey, what's happening around me? First, I knew that my dad was, he was getting checks from the VA, right? He was a physician, but he would get checks from the VA. He was a disabled veteran. And I just remember hearing, hey, disabled SDV, disabled veteran status. It's like, what is that? Oh, it's the government's going to give you 3% of the $1 trillion cut. And that's a $30 billion market. And there's hardly any companies. Like, I didn't go out to say, I'm going to create a service disabled business. But because of that opportunity presented itself, it's like, you got to be crazy not to take this, right? So that's kind of like, I feel like entrepreneurs kind of miss that a lot. They feel like I just got to do it, which by the way, you should, but if you see an opportunity and you can either be 18 or 58, right? Opportunities always present itself. And I always say it's not too late to be an entrepreneur, right? If there's money on the table, that there's an opportunity and everything, and it's like, there's you and maybe two other in the world that can do it, seize it, right? Like, I don't care if you're 70, you got to seize it, right? If the opportunity is there. And so about the product market fit stuff, we should probably cover that in a breakout room, but that's another thing.
And Strauss, I'll add to what Brian said right there. If you are early into the process, you know, I'll say I'm a kind of first-time entrepreneur here as well. What I found really helps is just to talk about your idea to basically anybody that will listen. It allows you to kind of hone it and make sure that there's actually a need, make sure you can communicate it. So, you know, ideas are fantastic. What's even more fantastic is if it's fitting a problem, if it is actually solving something. And so matchmaking that, really you get there by just talking about it with as many different types of people as you can.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Anusha.
Thank you all. So the next question is from Apurva, who had to drop out because she had a hard stop at 7. But her question is, as leaders, how do you go about upskilling yourselves? And how do you prioritize what skills you want to focus on?
One thing I would say is that's sort of one of the hardest things to do. And I would imagine for many Carnegie Mellon grads, you're very used to being very good at pretty much everything. and you're used to also feeling like you can do the best job at it. So it's really important early on to, recognize who on your team already has certain skills or who has the potential to build those skills, and really start building them from the get-go, because it may be a different timeline on when you hit your tipping point, but there will be a tipping point where you just cannot be everything for everybody. And you have to make sure that you are being leveraged to the best of your ability. And I've actually worked really closely with an executive coach. One thing that I was really fortunate to have is one of my investors set aside money specifically for executive coaching. And I was a little bit like, yeah, okay, let's see how it goes. But it was really great to have somebody who has no stake in your company whatsoever to talk to, and to really like be a mirror of what you're telling them, right? And like I got to this really great place this year where I actually was going back to her and going, I don't even know what I'm needed for anymore. Like everybody knows what to do, and while it seems like kind of a silly thing to say, it was actually this great epiphany of like really running a team so well and having people in place that feel empowered to do what they need to do, such that there are points in time when you almost feel like you're superfluous to the whole thing, which isn't true. The thing wouldn't be running as well if you weren't running it well. But that's where you want to get to. You don't, because, we would hope this is like a couple year journey and you exit and you're made it big and you go sit on a beach. But the truth is most things take a lot longer to get to an exit point or get to a point where it's scaling, so that you can relax like that. So you need to manage this as if it's a marathon and not a sprint.
Yeah, and I'll say from a technical perspective, I find that it's constant learning. I think in these fields, we are lifelong learners, and I find that especially with the frenetic schedule of a startup, I find it's easy to upskill if I pick a goal, like I actually want to accomplish something, or I want to, get ahead of a release plan and learn about a particular topic. Like I find that both time boxing it and putting kind of like a measurable event on the other end helps me to include it in the schedule. Just a tip that works for me.
Sounds good. Brian, do you want to add anything?
Well, I was looking at the other questions there. They're like a little bit pertinent there about, there was one question about the co-founder and is it needed? I could answer that. There was a couple of questions on lean startup. I could answer those questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So I would say the co-founders, it's not absolutely needed, but even though I did say this, like the worst thing VCs always say is pattern recognition. There's also a reason why there's pattern recognition is that they have, again, VCs, they're literally putting, billions of dollars into bets, right? And if it worked before, it's going to work again type of thing. That's kind of the mentality that they take. And so there is this report by Y Combinator, that basically they published all their analytics of like, hey, here are the type of companies we invested in, right? And, they'll say it's broken down by like demographics, right? Here are the percentage of women owned, right? Women-led founder, or at least one woman or a minority, right? Black, Latino, right? And they broke it down. And so one of the things that they had said was, yeah, solo entrepreneurs, it was like really, really low, right? The majority of them was like 2+ co-founders, but the solo was like, it was pretty bad. It was like, I think it was definitely less than 5%. So the thing is that although, going solo is okay, but you still have to kind of look at, you want to look at the money ball, right? You want to see like what works, and you want to kind of like figure it. You want to try to hit those check boxes, because at the end of the day, that's what they're doing, right? As much as you can, And then all the other stuff like the longer tail, you know, that's the stuff that you can control. Like I would say, you know, that are not as important. Maybe you can kind of get away with that. But I know the solo entrepreneur was like one of the major ones. Yeah, and then and then the other question was the pitching, right? So raising fund across the country, and is it easier virtually versus locally? You know, if you're in the DC area, it's always been harder to raise money locally, but it's easier. It depends what kind of company it is too. But generally speaking, it's always been easier to raise money in places like New York or Silicon Valley, just because there's just more money, right? But at the end of the day, if it's a great startup, right? And in fact, if you are able to raise money here and not in Silicon Valley, that's actually that's a stronger signal for you as a company than if you raise money in Silicon Valley. And the reason why I say that is because Silicon Valley and New York, they're always investing in their own companies, right? But if you have a technology that is comparative to Silicon Valley, and yet a big VC decided to invest in your company here in DC, that's actually a very, very strong signal. And we've seen many companies here, and maybe Nick, I don't know which, maybe you actually went out to one of my startup grad events, right? You know, there was like Foundation DB was a good example of that, right? We had SV Angels invest in that company, and they rarely invested money in companies outside of Silicon Valley, but they decided to invest in this company, right? That was locally here, and eventually that got sold to Apple, right? And you know, they had a very like scalable database, and literally like you can turn on and off like these the machines, and it wouldn't corrupt the database, right? Like really amazing tech, right? But you'll see like these types of like companies in the DC area where the tech is very strong, and then a outside VC would go invest and not into their own. That's very strong. So so it's like I said, it's really depending on your situation. But generally speaking, you want to get money where the money is, right? Which is going to be in these larger startup tech hubs.